Hey selectors, I'm Jack, and this is the Assist Line. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Alltears, who placed third at the recent Dallas GP with his trademark Nanashi deck. Hey Alltears, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good, Jack.
Full disclosure, just for a conflict of interest resolution, Alltears is my good friend in real life, at least I hope we're friends. At any rate, he goes to my locals.
Yep, I hope so.
Yeah, so I'm always very happy to see him place well, which he has been placing pretty well the past few GPs we've had, been playing since the game has been around, and much longer than that, at least in English. I mean, you were waiting 7 years, right, to play this game when it was only in Japanese?
Yeah, something like that. Like I watched the anime when it first aired in Japan. I ordered the initial print run of the starter decks and got them shipped over here from like Ami and stuff. So I've been a big fan of WIXOSS for a long time.
Yes, you have. You've been playing a long time, you've been grinding a long time, and you're the one that got me into this game, so thank you for that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess, or fortunately, depends on your point of view. But I'm glad that you're playing alongside me. It's always good to have another good test partner and play partner at locals and stuff.
Well, it's a lot better than some other card games we could be playing.
That is very true.
Okay, so at this point, getting back to the card game of WeCross and the Dallas GP, you piloted the Nanashi deck for 7 rounds, and then 3 rounds into Top Cut, you placed third. At this point, I think it might be difficult to imagine a selector that doesn't know what the Nanashi Dissona deck does, but I never like to just blindly assume that, so we always want to provide a brief deck overview. So, Alltears, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Nanashi Dissona deck, how you piloted it, how it works, and what makes it such a monster?
Sure. So the big thing with Nanashi Dissona is just, well, I guess the main keyword I would say for the entire deck is consistency. Hedonym, the partner signy for Nanashi, is just an extremely cracked card. Being able to pay black and pull anything back from your discard pile. Um, at any point, if she comes in during the attack phase for some reason off of a burst, or when you play her during main phase or anything like that, you can immediately pull back exactly what you need from the discard pile and build a board based off of that. So the main strategy of the deck is a lot of, I guess it's two main strategies. The first big one is you're going to be milling them out at least once. You're going to be getting probably 1 point of damage in. Nanashi's once per game is going to mill them out. Hedonym, while they're out, are going to mill them out. You should be getting a damage there. The second main thing is a lot of hand disruption. You'll notice off the deck list, there's Pawn Turtles, there's extras, there's a one of the Pyroluke Dissona in there. And then obviously the big cornerstone for one of the big power jumps in the deck is the Unrest piece. You can sort of take them from a full hand of like 5 or 6 cards and take them to 0 in a single turn if your hand is built properly enough or if you plan ahead enough, and you can totally disrupt their game plan. And whenever you decide to pull the trigger on that, you can be pretty selective. Like you can do it early on like turn 2, try to put them off balance going into turn 3, and they have to shape a hand with very little resources and build a board off of that. Or you can wait till the later game when they're pretty tapped out and it's pretty integral that they need a really good hand going into the rest of the game and just totally disrupt that. So you have a lot of consistent hand pressure. And then other than that, you just have a lot of really good, effective, relatively cheap ways to open holes on the board, continue pushing for 2 or 3 lanes every single turn, and just sort of go from there. And a big part of that reason is, like I said at the very beginning, Hedonym. Hedonym is going to allow you to pull whatever answers you need from the discard pile, whether that's grabbing an Ivy because you need to build some enter so you can use your assist the next turn, whether that's grabbing Bang Dissona so you're able to remove an Exia from the board, or something with Shadow. You can pull an Umar from the discard pile. You can pull an Alpha to pick off small things and threaten some more discard, or some more mill. It's just the whole deck is structured in a way where you have this big, massive toolbox in your discard pile, and you're always able to grab exactly what you need. And with that, you try and disrupt their game plan while also sculpting your board to perfectly counter what they do have available to them. And that's sort of, I think, the general gist of the deck.
I mean, yeah, Nanashi is monstrous at all of those things. I think when a lot of players think about a discard deck that has a lot of hand disruption and has a lot of toolboxing, they might think it's a little more slow and plodding. They might imagine, especially a color like white being in there. But what makes Nanashi so strong and you've mentioned this in your little overview here, Nanashi can discard and disrupt while at the same time maintaining pressure. Nanashi's Signy, unlike a lot of other like dirtily hand disruption decks, they're not all defensive. They will open holes, they will put pressure on, and while you're starving for resources, it's hard to kind of bounce back from the hand disruption and the board disruption that Nanashi does. And like you said, the way she does that in a lot of ways are very cheap. Unrest is a very efficient card. Nanashi herself is extremely efficient. Hedonym might be the most efficient card in the game.
Yeah, I mean, Hedonym really so much of the deck strength really falls back on Hedonym. She is just such a monster. Being able to threaten them with mill 4 every single turn, fantastic. Pulling back the answers you want at any given point for only a single black. I mean, heck, even just paying black to pull back an Ivy from the discard pile so she can enter charge you at the beginning of the attack phase, and then you've essentially paid back Hedonym's cost, and you can use that to build board while also maintaining hand size, so you're able to do like Mel 2 or anything like that. It's just such a flexible card that really builds the entire backbone of the deck.
Also worth mentioning, a lot of cards with Hedonym's effect that bring things back from the trash have a lot of caveats, most of them including a caveat that they cannot bring themselves back. But Hedonym has no such limitation, so you can lay down nothing on a turn except for one Hedonym, bring back another Hedonym, and then bring back something else. Suddenly you have a full board with one card and 2 enter, which is insane.
Right, even if you're playing off the top of your deck with a 0-card hand, because, discard pressure is so prevalent right now that sometimes it's inevitable that you're going to end up with 0 cards in hand. If you draw into a Hedonym or a way to get a Hedonym, whether that's Kagomeka, whether that's Matcha, discarding and drawing into a Hedonym, or one of the various methods that you have in here to also find more Hedonyms, you can just build an entire board off of that as long as you've got the enter.
Yeah, no question. Hedonym is probably the most efficient card in the game, arguably the most busted card in the game right now. I think there's like some competition for saying busted card versus efficient card, but I would definitely say in terms of efficiency, Hedonym's pretty unmatched.
Yeah, can't really beat just paying 1 black to pull whatever answer you want for, any given game state.
And on top of that, the card has other abilities too.
Right. I mean, we haven't even really talked about it, but the fact you can just play or pay 5 coins once and give something a minus 12k is fantastic. It means that she by herself can also threaten a lane on the board without doing anything else yet. The mill 4 is going to push you even closer to your opponent refreshing. And if a game goes long enough, one or multiple Hedonyms on the board can push them into a second refresh as well, which is also something that's a very realistic possibility right now with some of these grindier matchups.
There were grindier matchups at the Dallas GP. No doubt about that. I would say the most popular deck was a very grindy deck, but we'll get into that in a second. Now, it might feel like we've been talking a lot more about Hedonym than we've been talking about Nanashi herself, but I mean, that's just such an integral part of the deck and makes the entire thing work. And honestly, you could make a good argument that Hedonym is better than Nanashi in terms of what they do for the deck. I mean, this is really just the Hedonym deck.
Yeah, for sure. Hedonym is what really, really makes the deck. I mean, Nanashi's a great Elrig by herself, but it's just the pair up with Hedonym really pushes it over the edge.
Now, also worth mentioning, this is not the first time Nanashi Dissona has won a Grand Prix. This exact same deck, with the exact same build, minus using a different art Xeno cluster, won the Vegas GP in 2024 as well. So again, it's hard to imagine people don't know this deck or haven't seen this deck before, but, for anyone watching this years down the road or anyone who's less familiar with the game, this deck is monstrous. And the list is in the description and of course shown on the screen now. So I think that wraps us up for the deck overview itself. So let's talk about going into the GP, the months before, the weeks before, what we're thinking about, how we're prepping, and what we expect to see there. So question number 1 on that front, how did you decide to bring Nanashi Dissona to Grand Prix Dallas?
So I guess the funny story here is that I didn't really decide to bring Nanashi Dissona to the Grand Prix until about 9 hours before the Grand Prix itself. Immediately after the previous Grand Prix, GP3, I sort of looked forward and saw that the next scheduled one was in December and sort of projected that, okay, this is most likely going to be around Blue Archive, the collab pack, release date CPO2. So I already owned some of the Japanese cards, a full play set actually. I ended up ordering back when it released in Japan.
And you're big into Blue Archive. Sorry to interrupt, but let's just make that clear.
Oh yeah, for sure. I've been playing the game since launch and was super interested even before it officially launched in English. So I've been a big fan of Blue Archive like as long as it's been around. So getting to play it in my favorite card game is already, exactly what it's more than I could have ever hoped for, really. So I bought a bunch of the cards just specifically so I'd be able to learn the deck early, and just because I wanted a bunch of physical cards of a series I liked. But once I sort of projected that, okay, our next GP is probably going to be in Blue Archive meta, I started brewing. Now, I knew Azaza was already going to be a big threat in this GP, just because it was sort of the deck that had the most results in Japan. So with that in mind, I figured I'd probably be on either Azaza or Scirocco. I had played against Tetris's deck at the previous Grand Prix outside of the tournament, and he had run Scirocco against me. And I really liked the look of that deck. I really like Izuna. Izuna is a favorite character of mine to begin with, but I really liked her abilities. I really valued the toolboxing that she provided, pulling things in and out of Enter consistently and all that stuff. So I thought I was going to be on Scirocco, and I ended up building that deck, and I ended up testing it and altering it and running it into my friends for months. But I would just find myself losing to random things. Shout out to the Kumiho Whatnot streamer, her Discord. She was running some Grand Prix practice at a little tournament leading up to the Grand Prix, and I was just like losing random matches in that tournament against stuff that, like, not to talk down on any of the players I played or anything like that, but I was just like losing to decks that I feel like I shouldn't be losing to with like my level of piloting, with my level of experience, and with like my game knowledge, the knowledge I do have. Like, I figured I'd be able to handle those matchups a lot better, and I just wasn't. And I ended up pivoting off of Scirocco into Azaza. Azaza, I had been helping my play group and you as well test against that deck, so I had been piloting it like occasionally, so I knew how it worked. I knew the general idea of it, but going into the Grand Prix, I only had a couple weeks to practice with Azaza, like dedicated practice, and I still wasn't feeling it. It doesn't quite. So for me, I really like white decks, black decks, blue decks. I like the card draw. I like the consistency. I like the options. I really value the toolboxing.
As I recall, you were looking at bringing Remember herself to the Grand Prix for a bit there, weren't you?
Yeah, I was trying to brew something there as well. I mean, try and duplicate Azaza's Top Check 3, but for free, instead of needing a bond, and seeing if I'd be able to just build something off of that, because I had played Remember and gotten 6th place, I think it was, at Grand Prix 2. So I have a big soft spot in my heart for Remember, and I still really, really like that Elrig. So I was trying to see if I could even brew something up with that to make it work, but I couldn't quite get there, and Azaza didn't really give me the flexibility that I'm used to. So flying into Dallas, I was really caught between, do I go with Azaza or do I just pivot back to the deck that I've kept together since the previous Grand Prix, and have been practicing on and off with, and I'm pretty familiar with, because I've been practicing with the Nanashi Dissona deck since after Grand Prix 2. So the night before the Grand Prix, when it's like time to submit deck lists and everything, I figured I'm just gonna make a couple tweaks to my list. I had been running the common Japanese list that's still placing not super frequently, but still shows up in their meta over there, kind of card for card for the last year. And I figured I'd make a couple tweaks on that list that I had together and end up running that just because I was familiar with it. And that's really what it came down to at the end of the day. It gave me the options I wanted, and I had familiarity with it.
Selectors, I can say with absolute confidence it is so much better to come into any big tournament, especially a Grand Prix, with a deck that you're familiar with versus a deck you think is going to win. Trust me on this one. Now, you talked a little bit about what my next question is actually going to be, which is, what were some of the changes you made, if any, before the Grand Prix? You mentioned that night before you made a few tweaks. What were they?
So With the previous JP list that gets passed around a lot, it's just a absolutely refined monster. It has everything it needs. And it's like a toolboxer's dream. But walking into this Grand Prix, I knew looking at Blue Archive meta that I'm going to need something like Wawolf to be able to push pressure against those early game Maris that give the level 1 shadow. Um, and also, I expected Bang Dissona to be more important than ever. Whether that's running into Denonbu and them giving a full field of shadow, or going against Exia like always, or even just being able to get rid of some of those annoying blue archive boards with some of their oppressive level 3s. So the main changes I made were I took out the sort of flex spot mill Signy, Maho Maho Dissona, the Machina Dissona, and I ended up putting in 2 Wawolfs. They were not present in the deck before. And as well as going with an additional Bang. The previous deck only had 1. Those were the big changes I feel like I was expecting to make, and I realized while I was sort of thinking on it that my pretty much what I wanted to build is exactly the same as what won Grand Prix 3, XX9's deck. So I took a look at his deck, saw that he upped the count on Kagomeka from 1 to 2 as well, which I really liked, which would give me more access to the Hedonyms, the Bang, etc. And I ended up just copying his deck card for card. It worked for him. It had the changes I wanted going into Blue Archive meta. Honestly, I felt like it might even be better going into this meta than it was the Dissona meta, just because of a lot of the new threats that I was expecting to face. So the big changes: additional Kagomeka. I think 1 down on Ivy, took out the Maho, took out the Machina, plus Wallwolf, plus a Bang, and I think that's pretty much it. Everything else stayed just about the same.
Yeah, tools like Bang and Wawolf have really aged like a fine wine in the coming Blue Archive meta that we're experiencing now. Um, Back when Dissona first came out, Firecracker was a lot more prominent, and you saw a few more of the other Dissona level 3s in a bit higher numbers. But I mean, Bang and Wawolf have just really kept their value into whatever's been coming out. So we have talked about your deck, the brief overview, and the changes you made coming into the Grand Prix. We talked a little bit about what you expected to see there. And from that, I heard, you're looking at Azusa, you're looking at maybe Denonbu, you're looking at Exia decks. Is there anything besides those that you were thinking might be prevalent at the GP?
So there were a couple things I was expecting. I expected a good portion of the meta to still be on Dissona. I mean, not everybody likes Blue Archive. Not everybody's going to want to build Blue Archive. And also, Blue Archive only came out like 2 or 3 weeks before the GP, so not everybody will have their hands on it. So I could see a world where a lot of people still came out with their Dissona decks. So the Nanashis, the Piralukes, the Miko Mikos, I definitely expected to run into those. The other threat that I had built and practiced against was the mono white Tama build that still ran like I think it was the black and blue assists and things like that. But the main reason was they changed over to running chaos instead. Chaos, chaos, chaos as their main piece, which is definitely a unique threat against Nanashi because it turns off my access to the discard pile for an entire turn, which, with some good timing on their part, can totally shut down my game plan. So I expected to run into that to some extent too. But really, I think the biggest thing I was afraid of was just various Blue Archive decks and various Dissona decks. Of just a bunch of different Elrigs coming in.
All right. So, I mean, that properly sets the stage for the GP and everything leading up to it. So, why don't we go into the day itself and start with, your rounds before Top Cut from 1 to 7, and just tell us about your experience, starting with round 1.
Sure. So with round 1, I was super nervous going in, and of course, I end up having friendly fire right off the bat. I end up playing somebody, a close friend, from the gaming giant locals in Virginia, and he's piloting Scirocco. Now this is a friend I've been, I've known him as long as I've been playing WIXOSS in English. I drive out to Curio Cavern and Gaming Giant once every couple months for bigger events and stuff like that, and I keep touch with them on Discord and stuff. So even though it always sucks to play against somebody that especially from like a store that you sort of consider one of your locals, right off the bat, it's at least nice for the nerves that we're both super familiar with each other and could joke around and just be super friendly and play through.
We all do hate team kills.
Yeah, for sure. Now with his Scirocco deck, I had actually talked to him a decent bit in the months prior about some of the possibilities of Scirocco, and since I had piloted Scirocco myself for a decent couple of months, I was pretty familiar with the threats I was going to be running into, and the main thing that Scirocco is really, really good with is tucking a bunch of good cards up into enter right off the bat, and then using Izuna to toolbox those for the rest of the game into exactly what you need at any given point. So my main strategy was I wanted to try and disrupt him very, very early. So I think I had popped a lot of my discard on turn 2 and discarded him out 5 or 6 cards, and just tried to wipe away as many of the options he had to tuck a bunch of cards into enter at the very beginning and hope that that would unbalance him enough going into the later turns that I'd just be able to sort of clinch the win there. And that did end up working for me in this instance. He sort of had like a rough level 3, if I remember correct, and I just sort of was able to continue pushing, open 3 and pushing damage in, getting the refresh, and just closing the game out that way.
So if I could provide my obviously not as powerful analysis, being that I'm not really a top player myself, both of us tested with Scirocco extensively, and both of us really liked what Scirocco offered and what Scirocco did, especially with cards in her toolbox, like Izuna. Izuna's just a super, super cool card. However, I think what really brings her down in capability is the same thing that kind of took me off Haneo Dissona, which is a deck I'd been brewing for a long time too, and decided against taking to the GP because I just couldn't get it to work. Similar experiences with you and piloting Scirocco into things. I'm just not really getting there. The deck's not doing what I expect it to do. And I think it is that Scirocco herself, like Haneo Dissona, is deceptively greedy. You need a lot of resources to make her stuff work. Now, she generates a lot of them herself, and you would think that's enough, but often it's actually not. I mean, her bond ability allows you to take a Signy from Enter by paying 1, but that's 2 Enter for 1 card. And then you have to pay 2 to give something S Lancer. Izuna takes 2 to give herself Assassin. A lot of these things seem really toolboxy and really efficient, but they are actually very greedy. I mean, what do you think about that?
All right, I would definitely agree. You really have to pump a lot of cards into your enter, either with like Kaide, Tsubaki, putting cards from hand directly into enter so you have them available to you later on, and also build up the big chunk of enter that you have. I think one of the cards you really have to lean on is Hoshino. Getting down to lower life cloth relatively quick and then trying to stabilize from there so you can capitalize on Hoshino enter charging you 2 every single turn is another really valuable one, because that will fuel a lot of your effects. But yeah, I would definitely agree. Just in general, the deck can be surprisingly enter hungry. I mean, Scirocco needs the 2 for the S Lancer, Izuna needs the 2 for Assassin. If you bond Hoshino in some matchups, it might be a good call. That's 3 enter on entry to kill anything, vanish anything. So the deck costs end up adding up really, really quick, and you might have to spend a decent chunk of time in the game just really shoring up your enter to be able to afford the entire game, as well as your assists to close out the game as well. That's one of the reasons why I didn't end up going with a 3-stop in my Scirocco deck when I was testing it, and ended up on something like Pyroluke, which only stops 2. Even though it's a card I didn't like very much, I just couldn't consistently hold enough cards in hand or enter to 3-stop. I had to go down to just a 2-stop and hope that was enough.
Now, this might make me a bad player, but I still have not quite given up hope on Scirocco. I think maybe there's a combination of the right assists, the right pieces, and the right Signy, and maybe the right meta that we could get her to work. But I was just very disappointed.
No, I think like her Elrig in general is not weak. Consistent S Lancer every single turn is really good. The enter charge 3 once per game is really strong, and being able to pull something back of choice is great. Like, I think the core of the deck is really good. It might need some better assists, and I think it really needs like some focused brew time. I think the deck was sort of relatively unexplored, at least in terms of Japanese results, since the CPO2 meta was kind of weird in Japan before P15, and that a lot of Blue Archive decks sort of poofed in the wind just because P15 was the hot new set on the meta. Um, and Shiroko just seems like she didn't get explored super much, but I don't think she's bad by any means, and I'd love to see somebody really sort of brew it and try and find creative ways to do it, especially with Izuna. Izuna is such an awesome card, and that deck in particular is the one that really gets to utilize her to her fullest, I think.
Yeah, and as much as I love talking about Shiroko, this unfortunately is not a Shiroko deck tech video. So that was your round one. You won pretty handily against that, would you say?
Yeah, I would think so.
So moving on to round two, what was that like?
So my round two was against a P01 Hirana, running a pre-para package. So it was a very aggressive matchup where he was trying to push a bunch of damage with using like a lot of pre-paras, relatively efficient level 1, level 2s, to push some damage early in like the red pre-paras, the green pre-paras. And it was solidly aggressive, and was pushing damage very fast. But unfortunately for him, one of our locals at our shop that we go to every week has been playing pre-para since the set came out in English. So we're both very intimately familiar with the inner workings of pre-para and how to assemble board against it, and what sort of breakpoints are really important for them. So it was a matchup I was pretty confident going into. Again, I kind of realized, like, looking at Hirana and like the pre-para shell, I figured they were going to be kind of weak to some aggressive discard. So I went a bit overboard on trying to discard him out early. And that ended up paying off with some awkward turns at level 3 again and letting me cruise into a victory on that one.
Just imagine for a moment the shock of bringing pre-para all the way back from P10, correct?
Yes, I believe it was P10.
All the way back from P10 to the Dallas GP in 2024, sitting against an opponent in round two, and them saying, "Oh yeah, I totally know this matchup."
Yeah, absolutely wacky. Unfortunately, bad luck that I just happened to know it, right? Bad luck for them. But it was still a good match. It's still close as aggressive matches tend to be, but I was able to maneuver around a lot of the removal and try and make the turns awkward, so he would not be able to open up as much damage on me as I was able to open up against him.
Was he running the pre-para piece?
I do not recall what pieces they were on. Unfortunately, a lot of the early rounds are a bit of a blur to me because I was running on adrenaline. I was so nervous walking in because I felt like I was super unprepared. But yeah, I do not recall if they were on the pre-para piece or not. I don't believe they were. I think it might have been Connect Spinning.
Should have run the pre-para piece. That's why you lost.
I don't know. I mean, the Connect Spinning, assuming the Connect Spinning was the card, right? I don't, but like I feel like it fit into the aggressive matchup really well. Again, if my memory's correct, and that's what it was. But yeah, I mean that pre-power piece is extremely powerful for the amount of enter that you're paying for it. It's very efficient, with the cost being that you're running pre-par, I guess. But that Connect Spinning can really push that aggressive matchup forward, especially with Hirana's once per game being able to account for another damage too.
I don't know, man. You can't just run pre-par without the piece. What's that about? All right,
Yeah,
enough of that. Going into round three, how was the match there?
So unfortunately, round 3 was another friendly fire match. This time, with my girlfriend. She had shown up playing Denombu, and because we see each other all the time, obviously, I was extremely practiced going to this matchup. Now, I was actually very worried about this matchup because she can pretty easily steal wins off of me as well. The shadow field that you can build with their specific piece, pulling 3 things back from the discard pile, means that she's able to build a board that is immune to a lot of my removal except for Bang, and also means that my discard pressure is really only good for taking them to 0 cards probably once, but between Akino, between Denombu's level 3 game, I'm blanking on her name, but there's another one that lets you draw extra cards and extra enter every turn, and then also the piece for pulling 3 things back from the discard pile. Like, I can discard them to 0 probably once, but it's going to be very, very hard to keep them consistently low on cards the entire rest of the game. And because they can toolbox something from the discard pile for 1 turn for only 3 enter, and then also essentially have really powerful defense on the board while doing that, just discarding them and praying that they have some awkward turns also doesn't work super well either. So my main strategy was to try and aim for the refresh really fast to limit the options that they'll have in their discard pile relatively quickly, so when they do have to pop that piece, they only have a couple things to really pick from, and hoping that makes it awkward. And then the other main strat for me was to hold on to the bang, or find the bang and get it into my hand, or get it into my enter so I could grab it back when I needed it as fast as possible. Especially because a lot of the pre-para decks were on Ultra Superheroes and would refresh my discard pile. So if I could get a bang stored in enter and just pay it out later, or hold it in hand so I can go across that refresh and then immediately play it and use that to pop their Shadow Signy. That's sort of how I try and maneuver around this matchup. And it ended up working out in my favor, but we had a very close, extremely close game, as you'd expect from 2 people who have played against each other an infinite amount of times over the last couple years. So, but yeah, it was very, very good. Stunk to have to, play against her and knock her down to 2-1, but it was a very good match.
Yeah, it sounds that way. And, again, we hate team kills, but that is unfortunately kind of the name of the game going into any Grand Prix. And both of us know that. We've team killed multiple times. We've team killed each other. So,
yep, very true.
It's just going to happen. That about wraps up round 3. Going into round 4, post lunch break, what was the situation there?
So going into round 4, I ended up playing against Neru, and this is obviously my first time today playing against Blue Archive, but this was a deck I had also practiced at home a fair bit and had considered taking myself, just because a lot of the blue-black synergy in Blue Archive was something I really like, and obviously I like that sort of draw and discard play style as well. So I had thought about playing this deck for a little bit as well, even though I ditched the idea, but I was familiar with the deck sort of going in, even if it's a different build than I had. But in this match, it was pretty much going to be a discard slugfest, with both of us trying to get each other on 0 cards as fast as possible, and then, making the turns awkward and hoping to capitalize off of that. But I guess lucky for me, being on unrest, I sort of had an emergency button to slam and get a big burst of discard power all at once when I needed it. That also refills my hand too. So I was able to sort of capitalize off of that to put them relatively low on cards and just sort of cruise on making awkward boards. Obviously, the heated ims and things like that, being able to recur the options I needed was very good, was extremely helpful, and trying to get that refresh off relatively fast too. But we did both keep each other on low hand for a lot of the game. The one thing with Blue Archive is that when I'm sitting across from that deck, I know they're not on Xenocluster, just because they're going to be running 2 Blue Archive pieces most of the time, so that they're able to get both of their bonds off, which are extremely important. But that means that me with Xenocluster, I'm able to recover a little bit from the discard that's coming in, and then Unrest also generating me an additional 2 cards there too, and then Hedonym allowing me to conserve hand size a little bit. I don't need to consistently field 3 things from hand. I can recur some things back. I was able to sort of win the slug match on hand size and get the win on that one.
Yeah, I mean, discard and discard matches are who can draw more cards, and I think between those 2 decks, Nanashi actually wins, which you wouldn't think, because Neru is not only a blue Elric, but she has a draw-focused set of abilities. But, sometimes that's just not enough.
Yeah, just being able to recover with, like I said, the Xeno cluster, you might be able to discard me to 0, but I'm going to enter the next turn with a full grip, or I'm able to build a full grip off of the cards that I have drawn. Again, you can't overstate it enough. Hedonym, pull back the exact card I need every single turn, versus the Neru side, where you might have to just top deck into some answers and hope that you're able to continue threatening damage that way.
All right, well, that sums up round 4. Round 5, where do we go from here?
So going into round 5, obviously the pressure is on for me because I'm at 4-0 and know that top cut is a very realistic possibility. And I ended up sitting across from a deck that I was actually pretty afraid of, that mono white Tama with Chaos. So go figure. Once again, I'm very lucky that I had built this deck at home and played it enough times that I was pretty familiar with it. But my opponent was also extremely familiar with the Nanashi matchup. And after talking to him a bit, he had told me he believes this one's really a 50-50. Sort of depends on the burst luck and also, the top decking. But the mono white Tama is just such high value cards that are hard to get rid of and can really make my life difficult. You've got the Exias, you've got like the Remember Memorias, you've got really efficient removal with like the over pursuits and things like that, and then obviously Chaos being able to make my make one of my turns extremely awkward, where I'm not going to be able to touch my discard pile. But I was able to maneuver around that pretty well. I got some early damage in and got it to stick, which put the pace in my favor. And then I had used, once again, strat of I just try and hold Unrest until I can do Unrest with combination of extras and pawn turtles and everything to take their hand down to 0. Tama can recover from that better than some decks if I pop it too early, just because her come into play ability, being able to draw or look at the top 4 and take 2, by default is going to pad her hand back up going into level 3. So I can't really shut them out of cards at level 2 and pray that they just have awkward draws. Tama is able to fix that a decent bit. But even if Tom is not able to break my board, the threat of constant double attacks, double Elrig attacks is huge. But thankfully, I was able to get a hold of my servants and fend off some of those attacks early, and was able to sort of cruise into a victory from there using that early momentum I got.
Yep, Nanashi can definitely keep tempo. So that wraps up round 5. Round 6. How was it?
So round 6 was going into my first Azusa of the day. This was against.
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah, I know. How about it? And I definitely got lucky on that front. But this was at this point, I think it was just me and Scob who were undefeated going into round 6, and going against his Azusa. And the Azusa matchups definitely, unfortunately, like I had played a decent chunk of Azusa at home and prepping for the tournament, but I hadn't got to necessarily practice Nanashi versus Azusa as much as I had really hoped to. In the practice I did get, one of the things that seemed to give me the best results is that if I put on the discard pressure really, really early and was able to make their turn 3 or turn 4 sort of awkward in terms of draws, I would be able to try and get a bunch of damage in very quick, and then use the remaining turns after that to just squeak in another 1 or 2 for the win. That hopefully, if I can get them below that 3 life threshold where Azusa is no longer trashing things and is just bouncing them back to hand, that I can keep that momentum and just squeak in another few damage and try and get the win off of that. But unfortunately in this matchup, well, I wouldn't say unfortunately, I think the match went pretty well. We were pretty close up until the end, but I had made a pretty bad misplay on my final turn. I had lost count of a life burst that I had previously counted before the refresh, and I had lost track of what card it was. So I thought I was relatively clear to open 2 for the win, and I ended up overcommitting resources to do it, spending out too much enter, which then locked me out of doing my Mel 2 to stop the incoming damage the next turn that ended up killing me. So it was a pretty bad misplay on my part, but it was my first real big misplay of the day, so I can't beat myself up about it too much. But it was a very, very good game, and I would say Scob readily beat me, but I at this point I was feeling pretty good regardless of being 5-1 now, knowing that I'm probably still locked in for top cut. And even if I lost one, like the pressure is relatively off and I can sort of relax a bit.
Yeah, worth mentioning. You mentioned that Azusa is not a matchup you tested Nanashi into that often. One of the things that testing so many matchups allows you to do when you come into a Grand Prix is devote a lot less headspace to figuring out what they're doing so you can concentrate on what you're doing better. But if you haven't tested against that matchup, the headspace that you might have needed to keep track of those life bursts versus what you're doing, it might not be there. So that is really the value of testing, practicing, and prep.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And on top of that, like the version of Azaza that I had gotten to play against a little bit, and also that I had been testing, I had gone through a couple iterations, but one of them was Modica Dub and Yuka Yuka, and the other was, I think, Dub and Machina Repair. I had played a little bit online with Ray as a thought after I had seen some decks in Japan that had done something similar, but I never really got to like flesh that thought out too much and really test with it or against it. So sitting down across from the Ray matchup, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I can get the pressure in a bit more because they have less defenses, but it didn't really pan out that way.
Well, that brings us to round 7, final round before Top Cut. What happened?
So round 7 was against a Miyu, which I was absolutely thrilled to see, and Blue Archive Miyu on top of that. In this matchup, I knew I've never really played against Miyu. Obviously, it's not a super popular L-Rig to play, and she's not very well represented either in English or Japanese, which was part of the reason I was so thrilled to see it. Just very cool to see L-Rigs like that get high placements, especially with Takara Tomy getting rid of, or whoever you want to say is getting rid of the top L-Rig prizes right now.
You got to bring it back. You got to bring it back.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But yeah, seeing a Miyu in the 7th round when we're both sitting at like 5-1 is awesome, and I was thrilled for that. But the one thing I do know about Miyu is that she has her once per game that's going to make it extremely expensive for me to put something in one of my open lanes. So I ended up spending a lot of time in this game cycling Ivies, which I hadn't had to do as much in my previous games. Some in the Azaza match, but not too much in the others. But I think on turn 2, I had double Ivied, and then either on like turn 3 or turn 4, I did it again, just trying to build a massive amount of enter so that once he would do the once per game, I would still be able to play it. I'd still be able to try and threaten 2 or 3 lanes and push damage, and then still have enough enter to be able to afford my 3-stop when it's important at the very end of the game. Now, luckily, like the Mel Revise helps me out with that, giving me an additional 2 enter there, but I really, really needed those Ivies to build up enters just so I'd be able to pay all the costs, which I ended up doing. Once again, the discard pressure really helped me a lot, but the Miyu, I think they were on Chaos. Still that's a mill out right there that I'm going to be eating a damage from, locks me on a discard pile. So I just had to try and get damage in early, continually pressure 2 or 3, but bank on Ivy as much as possible to build up the enter just so I can sort of pay all my costs and get through it, which ended up working out for me.
Now that's interesting. You mentioned the Mew was on Chaos, but also running a Blue Archive Signy package, so did they not bond?
They did not bond. The thing with the Blue Archive Signy is that a lot of their abilities are really, really good, even if you don't necessarily have the additional bond abilities on them. There's just some really good, powerful effects in there. So they were just banking on the fact that, I don't want to speak for them, but they used a lot of those powerful synergies and combined alongside Miyu to put a lot of pressure on the opponent, and then using much better pieces than the Blue Archive ones to push damage and recur cards back from the discard pile, push additional board pressure, anything like that, and it worked very well.
So the Blue Archive students do not need Sensei's love to prosper.
They do not.
Well, I know some people are going to be sad to hear that, but that might just be the way it is. So that's round 7. You won against Mew. That makes you a 6-1 before Top Cut. You are pretty much guaranteed top 8 at this point. So, tournament ends, we go through deck check, and you're sitting down to fight in the Top Cut round 1. How'd it go?
So round one, we end up opening, flipping all, everybody sits down, we all start our games at the same time. And me and my opponent, and then my person sitting to the left of me, as well as their opponent, all four of us open Nanashi. And I'm like, oh, I see they put us, in the Nanashi corner over here. Here's four people playing Nanashi. So I'm playing against Nanashi. And obviously, this is a matchup I'm extremely familiar with, even though, just because of piloting the deck myself. But even though their build was a bit different than mine, I sort of knew where I had to navigate. Now, having the higher seed let me pick to go first, and I really tried to bank on that to be the one to put the pressure on first to try to make their recovery turns as awkward as possible. So I think I've done Unrest relatively fast. They had done Unrest back to me in return relatively fast, and I Xeno'd off of that to try and rebuild hand. But I think for the most part, it was a lot of us just trying to open 3, pushing as much damage as possible, and me hoping I can make it awkward enough with my earlier pressure and going first that they won't be able to put the same pressure back on me. But I think the real key turn is that I ended up making a concerted effort to field 2 Bang Dissonas with enough enter in my enter zone to have them both at 15k. And because of that, Nanashi has a really, really hard time getting past 2 Bang Dissona 15k shadow level 3. So you can't hit them with the coin ability. You can technically get them with another Bang Dissona, but with a lot of the earlier pressure I tried to put on, I'm trying to bank on the fact that they're not going to be able to get a bang in response to bang one of my bangs. But really, that I feel like that turn ended up being the key. Just 2 unoutable spots on the board that they couldn't really handle, and I kind of went with the momentum from there for the win.
Yeah, obviously piloting Nanashi for 8 rounds now has really familiarized you with the matchup today, and you've got a lot of practice with it in the past, so not surprising you were able to pilot your way to victory there. Which brings us to round 2 Top Cut. You are thus far undefeated in Top Cut. How'd round 2 go?
So for round 2, top 4 ended up being 2 Azazas and 2 Nanashis. So I was playing the Azaza matchup as well as the other Nanashi was playing their Azaza matchup. So 2 of the exact same matchup, unfortunately. But going in, I knew it was going to be pretty much the same build that I had played in round 6, and I was hoping that after losing in round 6, I might be able to pivot my strategy a bit, try something a little bit different. But I think I got a bit too carried away early on into this one. I had managed to stake a bunch of early damage and take a pretty early lead, and I was thinking maybe I could capitalize off of that momentum to try and get them again below that 2 life cloth threshold and sort of shut down a lot of the really easy trash removal that they would have access to, and just try and do what I did back at home and capitalize off them being off balance and try and get the win from there. Unfortunately, my opponent was able to stabilize really, really well, despite being able to, despite me trying to disrupt them. And they had a lot of practice against this matchup, so they kind of knew exactly how to handle me, unfortunately. So I ended up sort of hitting a point where I had exhausted a lot of my resources. I was pretty much top decking every turn, and I'm staring down a field of like 12k Yukas, 12k Hibikis, some combination of those, usually another 12k Hasumi, and I don't have a lot of ways at this point to really push damage, nor do I have a lot of enter, obviously. Azaza's really good at denying me the enter, and unless I'm standing up a bunch of Ivies to build up enter at that late in the game, I don't really, if I'm in top deck mode, I'm sort of beholden to whatever I'm drawing. The main thing I was digging for to try and dig myself out of the hole at the end was an Umer Dissona. Umer Dissona and some combination of maybe 1 or 2 other cards would be able to push through for multiple lanes in a turn. My opponent was only at 1 life cloth and sort of rapidly approaching a refresh as well. And I was really hoping that Umer would be able to, minus 12k on attack. I can sweep into any of the lanes because we've spent more than 3 turns at level 3 at this point, so all their lanes are infected, which means Nanashi's static auto is giving them all minus 3k during my attack phase. So Dissona would be able to attack straight through, and if I could combine that with either multiple other cards in my hand and give minus power to kill something to avoid Yuka from stopping any of my hard removal. Like a Bang Dissona wouldn't really get me there because Yuka will just let them discard 2 cards and save it. So I really needed minus power to get me there. But we ended up hitting this kind of weird stalemate where my opponent, if I recall correct, had sort of lost track of where my last hedonym was and what my last burst was going into the refresh. And so they were afraid of hitting that last burst for me, and if they weren't able to just win immediately. And for me, I just couldn't push a damage in, but I also couldn't just straight up kill their Signy because I knew I had no burst left in my life cloth. So if I gave them the enter to pay for Oz's removal ability, I am just immediately going to lose. So we ended up passing back and forth, like draw, maybe change the field around a little bit, and then pass with no attacks for multiple turns in a row. I think like 4 or 5 turns. Me digging for Umers and my opponent just trying to get the right combination of cards where they'd be able to shut me down in one fell swoop and get the trash and go for the remaining life cloth and discard me out and everything. Like I said, they were really, really practicing the matchup. They sort of knew how to handle me at the end there, and I couldn't really find the answers I needed to push through for the last life cloth. So that sort of ended my top cut run. And that's about it there.
Well, it didn't quite end your top cut run. There was an additional game that got played between 3rd and 4th place.
Oh, yeah. I forgot all about it. Not because it was a forgettable game, but it was just sort of comical.
Can you explain to me how that happened? Because I'm actually not sure.
Oh, yeah. So at that point, I thought I was totally done. But the way the Mugen Shoujo invites work in order to play at like sort of worlds in Japan. So the top 2 people who win this Grand Prix, I guess just for anybody listening and who doesn't know, 1st and 2nd place get an invite to go play in the Mugen Shoujo tournament in Japan at the beginning of next year with people from other areas of the world like Europe. I think China has invites. Obviously, the Japanese players who have won big regionals or their Grand Prix equivalents. But the top 2 get to go. But if any of the top 2 don't accept the invite, it will trickle down to 3rd place, 4th place, until they find the correct home. Now, we already knew going into, so first they had to ask the top 2 going into finals, like, are you both cool with accepting the invite? Which they were. So at that point, I thought I was done for the day because, there's no reason to play for 3rd and 4th if they're both already locked into going. But from what I was told, they wanted a picture. I guess Tucker Tommy wanted a picture of top 3. They wanted top 8, top 4, top 3. So because of that, I was playing for picture rights, and me and Bubble Person was my opponent for 4th place, fighting for 3rd and 4th, and we both kind of just looked at each other. We're just like, yeah, okay, we'll just play it out, whatever. At this point, all the pressure's off. It doesn't really matter. I don't want to just hand wave it and say I give up, you can have it, because like once you've told me I should play the game, my fighting instinct immediately goes back in. I want to play it out and take it as seriously as possible. But there's also, no real pressure there because we're just fighting for the prizing doesn't change. It's just we're taking one more picture. But that's how we ended up going for that 3rd or 4th place match.
And how did that 3rd or 4th place match go?
So for that match, Bubble Person and I are both playing the Nanashi Mirror, and our decks are almost exactly the same, except like a 1-card difference, I think, at this point, is what we ended up discussing. Now, since I had better placement in Swiss again, I was able to choose if I go 1st or 2nd. So I ended up going 1st, hoping that I can sort of capitalize on the same strategy that I did for my 1st match in Top Cut to be able to make their life kind of awkward and assemble a strong board that would be hard for them to break. Because one of the nice things about Nanashi going first into the mirror is that when I hit level 3 and they're still at level 2, a lot of Nanashi's level 1s and level 2s have relatively low power. So it gives me a lot of easy targets to pick off with like Carcharo or Musica or my viruses or Alos Piraluk or Wawolf or anything. So I'm hoping that it will make me able to open 3 really easy on my first turn at level 3, push in for a full board that way, and then save a lot of my better removal, like Hedonym once per game and Nanashi once per game for later in the match. Again, sort of capitalizing off my strats earlier as well. Turn 2, I immediately pushed on rest. I think I discarded him like 5 cards or something. He Xeno'd. He goes into his turn 2. I think he popped his unrest. I Xeno'd. And we just so it was a real slug match. Both of us were just opening 3, pushing in for as much damage as possible, and trying to see who sticks. But my early disruption, I think, kind of got me there. It was an extremely close match. Both of us were very knowledgeable on the deck as well as the matchup. So it was a really good game. It was a really fun game, too. I had a great time playing against both persons. So even though it was sort of like a relatively unimportant game in the grand scheme of things, both of us took it very seriously and tried to push for the win. And we had a really, really good game.
And you did win those picture rights.
I did win the picture rights, so just another picture I had to stand up there for and give a peace sign or something like that. But at the end of the day, I guess I'm pretty happy with being able to say, I got 3rd. So it's cool to be in like the top 3 placement, bronze at the end, even if the prizes didn't change. It's kind of cool.
Well, remember, this is top 3 out of 82 of the best players in the United States and probably some of the world. I mean, some people traveled to the United States from other countries to play, so your competition is not weak, and placing 3rd in that is no small task. So again, congratulations, and just well played.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I mean, credits go to the WIXOSS community as well. Like whenever I come to one of these Grand Prix, and I've gone to all of them so far, I see a lot of the same faces. Probably half the crowd is usually I'm pretty familiar with or good friends with. We all know each other by name or handle online or things like that. But I know that all these people have been playing the game for nearly as long as I have, if not longer. And they're not easy throwaway matches. Like these people are all grinders. We're all coming out to these major tournaments. A lot of the same, like I said, the same faces coming out. I know whenever I sit across from any of them, it's going to be a good game, even if the stress is off because I'm familiar with them. They're not ever free wins. The WIXOSS community who shows up for these tournaments is always very, very strong. And even though I love playing against everybody, they make for very, very stressful tournaments, very stressful days.
Stressful, but very fun.
Yes, I agree.
All right, so that brings us to the end of the GP. Again, you placed 3rd. Again, congratulations. So with all that said, do you have any post-GP thoughts? Like, first of all, between what you thought was going to show up and what you saw, were there major differences?
There weren't really any major differences. There was more Azusa than I expected. I expected a lot of Azusa, but I didn't expect the amount that there was that other people were playing. Obviously, I went over my rounds and I didn't run into too many. Lucky enough for me, but from the sounds of it, from the numbers I'm hearing, there were just a lot. And again, we harped on it just a little tiny bit, but getting rid of that top Elric prize really kills diversity. So for a lot of players, if you're coming out to this GP to play, people aren't going further so that they can get the bragging rights of top Elrig anymore. If they're spending the money to come out here to play, they're playing to win.
Bring back top Elrig prizing.
Yes, very much so. So there was a lot of Azusa in the room. There was a lot of talk in the months leading up to the GP that Azusa is going to be the best deck. I think a lot of people expected that. I thought there would be more counterplay into Azusa because of that, and that less people would be on Azusa, but that really didn't end up being true. I also saw less, at least in the tables I had crossed through, I saw less other Dissona stuff than I expected. I expected to see not saying a ton, but more like Piraluk and Miko Miko and stuff like that. But really, the main Dissona deck I saw represented was Nanashi, which I guess shouldn't be too much of a surprise since they won the last GP. But it still was a surprise that I feel like a lot of the other ones sort of faded out. But for the most part, I'd say big portion still Dissona, big portion still Blue Archive, and that part by itself was not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, top 8, 4 of those were still Nanashi, so Dissona's still very much a thing, but maybe not Dissona that's not Nanashi.
Now, I think Miko Miko probably could have done pretty well. And I know there's at least a Miko Miko who was in top 16 as well, but I don't think she was a very highly represented deck. But I think she was pretty good into it from the little bit of testing that I did. It was a deck that I was going to consider trying to learn for the GP as well before, pivoting to Azaza and Nanashi as my main things I was discussing. Um, and I think Piraluk is still really, really good too. I do know there were a couple of those. I didn't keep track of how well everybody who was on it did. But like I think she's still really strong. But I also think she's a very hard deck to pilot, and maybe that affected the consistency of getting seeing a bunch of them move up into top cut and things like that. But yeah, I think D-Zone is still very strong. There's just a lot of really good options in there to play. The main deck base is still very powerful and can definitely give Blue Archive a pretty equal run for its money a lot of the time.
Well, that said, I mean, we have a situation where 4 Nanashi went into top 8, 3 Azusa went into top 8, and then by the top cut, the Nanashis had both been defeated by Azusa. And you mentioned that your only loss in Swiss was to Azusa. So do you have thoughts on the Nanashi versus Azusa matchup? Do you think it's just skewed in Azusa's favor in this case? Do you think it just needs more testing, more prep, more play to make it a little more even? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts were I honestly think I don't think it's like an absolute shutout, blowout, anything like that. There are times Azaza will just take a bunch of damage and die. It can be put off of into some awkward turns and then not be able to recover really well. Now in my case, in my matches, they were able to recover and they were super familiar with the matchup. But honestly, I think the knowledge difference was the biggest thing contributing to my loss in both of those. They were a lot more practiced going into me than I was practiced going into them. And that was just a preparation difference. And I think that's what really pushed it over. I think if I had been equally proficient, I would have been able to maneuver a lot better into them, I think, and maybe squeak out something more. Also, some of the deck choices, the deck changes I had made probably made me a bit weaker into that matchup. I had talked to Starfruit a little bit about it afterwards, and he had given me some insight into why the JP style decks were still running the things like the Maho Maho and the Machina, and how they could have possibly helped me out in that matchup too. And that made a lot of sense. Now, I don't regret the changes I made going in, or working with XX9's exact build from the previous GP. I think they helped me out significantly through the entire day. But there's definitely some card choices that maybe could have been re-included or finagled around a little bit more that would have postured me better into Azaza, but maybe worse into other things, if that makes sense. So I think if I guess to summarize, if I had been more knowledgeable and a bit more practiced, and I guess had my pulse on just how much Azaza was really going to be there, I probably could have done a lot better. But a lot of that was also just due to me not having a deck decided on until the night before the GP. Like I didn't expect months ago that I was going to be playing Nanashi at this Grand Prix. So maybe I could have prepped a lot better if I had really buckled down and decided that.
Well, it's funny you went in that direction because I was actually going to ask, after looking at the GP and your rounds, were there any changes you might have made the deck with the experience you have now? And you did talk about that. You talked about kind of conversing with Starfruit about the importance of Machina, the Maho Maho, playing with the ratios a little bit, and why it might be better into Azusa, but not necessarily better into other things. And that's going to be a meta-dependent call. So, honestly, that really wraps it up. We talked about the deck overview. We talked about what it's good into, why it's strong, how it works, what things were like before the GP, how you came to decide on the deck, your rounds, your experience in Top Cut, looking back, and your reflections after that. Do you have any final thoughts?
Um, I think honestly the biggest thought I have is I love this deck. I love Nanashi Dissona. If you have not tried it out yet, for anybody who's listening who has not played it, I highly recommend it. It's got so much more depth than I imagined when I first picked it up. I knew it was going to be a toolboxer's dream, and that's the kind of stuff I like, but I'm always discovering new things about it. I'm always finding new strats and making some crazy plays with it. And I just, I hope other people can maybe try it out some point and really see that. It's a very, very cool deck. And other than that, probably just a little bit of what I said. Shout out to the WIXOSS community. Everybody I've ever met, everybody I've ever played at any of the GPs, especially this GP, they're all great. Everybody's super friendly, no drama, no problems. It's always fantastic. It's always a great time. And big shout out to locals. I mean, Stevenson Games, Curio Cavern, Gaming Giant, places that I have played at somewhat frequently. Shout out to our testing group, and shout out to you as well. You're always good for bouncing stuff off, and just good practice and good learning.
Well, I really do appreciate the shout out. And I mean, same to you. You've been an invaluable teacher and test partner and friend. So I always enjoy interviewing you. I always love when you place high, and I'm hoping to do another interview with you come the next GP. So thanks for doing this, Alltears. And again, congratulations. Well played. And I know we will likely see each other at the next GP, and hopefully we'll be doing this again.
I hope so. I mean, the real question though is who's going to interview you when you get that top cut, right?
Oh, please.
No, I will absolutely see you there. You're bound for it one of these days.
All right. Well, he's more optimistic than I am, but maybe one day. All right, selectors, that's going to be it for this interview. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was a good interview for you. And we're going to sign off, and I'm going to let Alltears go here. See ya.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for calling the assist line. The WeCross media you requested is complete. However, please stay on the line for more content. To subscribe and receive more WeCross content, please press the subscribe button on your screen now. The assist line values your feedback and encourages you to leave your comments in the indicated section. To repeat this media, press the replay button on your device.